Hello, everyone. Welcome to this wonderful new site. I'm Peter Robinson. I'm a member of the Shakespeare on the Saskatchewan board in kind of place of alternation of Joe Rochester, who is the long-standing academic member of the board. I teach English at the University of Saskatchewan, as does Joe, and Gordon DeBrise here speaks history, teaches history and speaks it. And of course, Will, who I really need to say nothing about whatever. And the theme of this discussion is essentially Shakespeare in the time, and particularly the Scottish play in the time of the pandemic. So all four of us will give some kind of perspective on that. Will speak first. The format is that we've agreed each of us will talk for about 5 to 7 minutes or so, and that will allow time for about 15 or 20 minutes of questions at the end. And yes, what you are saying and what we say will be taken down and used against us in videos sometime in the future. So, Will, you can begin first.
Cool. You can hear me okay? Oh yeah, that's nice. I'm not sure because not everybody has necessarily seen the show. Just out of curiosity, how many people have already seen the show? So we're about half and half. Okay. So maybe just a really quick basic idea of how we approach the show. It's super weird. That's how we did it. The show is very much an adaptation of Shakespeare's play, and I've always been a big fan of sort of delineating the difference between when we edit something or when we cut something and when we adapt something. And certainly in this one, I very much took the approach that it was an adaptation and that all things were fair game. Sorry, Mr. Shakespeare, rolling over in your grave. And what we ended up doing, the show is staged essentially with 4 pandemic protocols. So when we started working on the play back in the fall, after the previous version of Macbeth got canceled, we started working on this adaptation almost immediately and trying to figure out what version of the show or what approach to the show was going to give us the best chance of possibly having it in front of a live audience. And that was a huge driving factor to all of the decisions. So there was a lot of logistical pushes on how we had to approach the show, which frankly, that's always the case in theater. We always end up working under a lot of logistical things, a lot of realities, a lot of opening night is going to be opening night whether you like it or not, all of those kinds of things. So the set is behind me here, and as you can see, there's 5 tree stumps, which essentially function as altars during the play, and 5 actors enter the space at the beginning of the show. They crawl up on their platform. They never leave it during the entire show. They never touch each other. They never come in contact with each other. They never come within 6 feet of each other. They never touch a prop. They never pull a costume from off stage. There's literally no backstage. All of those kinds of things. It's done in 90 minutes with no intermission because at the time we weren't allowed to have people mingle at an intermission, those kinds of things. So it ends up being a pretty unique kind of a production, and I would say the most interesting thing for me over the course of creating this adaptation is that it really forces you to go to the heart of what theater is and to try to adapt the piece based on that. As we were entering into the fall and people were starting to figure out how they're going to have theater companies operate in the future, everybody starts talking digital, everybody starts talking filming, put it on the internet, all of these kinds of things. And as Melanie, our general manager, knows, cranky old man Will said, no, I want people. And it was a big gamble, and thankfully Melanie, our general manager, went along with a lot of that stuff because it's terrifying for us as a theater company not know whether or not what you're going to do will ever actually be able to happen. So I very, very specifically spent a lot of time adapting the show to give us the best chance of being live in front of an audience. And we said to ourselves that if that's 10 people, fine, we're still doing it. If that's 200 people, which is what it kind of ended up being, great, that's what we'll do. So the play itself is reordered and rejigged, and there's lots of storyline that's removed, and it also has a sort of a very I was going to say non-linear, but that's not quite right, non-logical approach. Everything is very much done based on the instinctual. So we tried as we went through to go, okay, this piece of information that's in the play, you know, the background of how Malcolm went to England or you know, left and came back and all those kinds of things, does that actually matter for somebody to be able to follow the emotional journey of the play? If the answer is yes, then we're going to fight like crazy to find a way to present that piece of information. If the answer is no, then I don't care, get it out, move on, because we've got a whole lot of other things that we got to figure out. And what I ended up finding through the adaptation process is that I had ripped a whole bunch of tools away from actors in how they normally know how to speak to an audience. And I'd ripped them away from myself as a director and all those kinds of things. So I very much tried to replace those things in the script with other storytelling tools. Because as I say, at the end of the day, you got to go to the heart of what theater is, and it's at minimum one person talking to another person, relaying an experience or telling a story. That's the heart of what we do. So what we ended up giving ourselves was a lot of visual storytelling tools. So we brought a choreographer in to work on the show and to work on the movement style and the gestural language and the fights and the violence and things like that. We had a rather significant sound design to really help us tell the story and tell the emotional journey. A lot of parts of the text or the story were replaced by these things. Sound design, choreographer, a lot of visual storytelling in the lighting design is quite active. We've got images that we put up back on the screen here, all kinds of things. And it was a little terrifying, it was a lot terrifying, because what we're putting in front of an audience is something that we quite legitimately don't know if it's going to work, because it's not what we normally do. It's not the tricks that we normally use. It's not the tools we normally use. It's not how we usually get by, which at the end of the day, as an artist, is a massive gift. And while you're wrestling through it and trying to fight through it, and I see Jenna's back here in the audience, who's one of our standby artists, who had to wrestle through learning about 15 different roles when there was no time to actually physically get up and do it. As we're wrestling through those things, a lot of these things feel like they're hampering you. They feel like that they're not a gift because they're hard, they're difficult. They make you question how you do theater. They make you question how you work as an actor or a director or those kinds of things. But in hindsight, you start to understand how much of a gift that is, because when you're working as an artist, with any of those kinds of artists, if you've already got the answer when you start, you're kind of screwed. Because then the work that you do is going to be obvious, it's going to be boring, it's going to be what everybody expects, it's going to be what they saw last week or last year or last decade. In this case, everything was taken away. There were no rules, there were no tricks, there were no toys, there were no tools, there was nothing that we could rely on that we know worked last year. Because last year, quite frankly, didn't count anymore. And that makes you go through a really, really difficult process as an artist to sit down and think, okay, who's sitting in my audience? What do they feel like? What are they experiencing right now? And how can I speak to them in a way that I've never spoken to them before? And at the end of the day, that's the gift of this kind of process. To be able to start from scratch in many ways and screw up and fail and not know whether it's going to work. I don't think I have ever had a show where I was legitimately on first audience night going, I like it. And then I had this conversation with Joshua, who plays Macbeth in the show. We had this conversation a number of times. He would come to me and go, is it going to work? And then the next day I'd come back to him and go, is it going to work? And we would both go, I don't know. And then we would both go, I like it. And then we would go, the audience is coming tomorrow. See you tomorrow. And we have no idea. And while it's very difficult and challenging and frustrating and exhausting and all of those kinds of things, it is what we're supposed to be doing as artists. And that's, I guess, the secret gift that the pandemic gave us on this process. And we hope, as an industry, as an art form, that for all of us who are coming out of the pandemic to start creating art for audiences again, that we will be able to bring something new out of these things and do things in a different way. And I'm way over my 5 minutes, so I should totally stop. But at the end of the day, I guess I would just sum it up as saying it was a really, really, really hard process for absolutely everybody involved, but also a really generous and really exciting and fresh and new process for everybody involved. And I mean everybody who creates the process, because front of house doesn't know what they're doing. Props, we didn't have a props master. Everything was unknown and different. And I think we're kind of thankful for that at the end of the day.
Well, thanks, Will. And I'm Gordon Deversay from the History Department, and being an historian, I have a script, but you'll be pleased to know that I'm going to diverge from it. Because, Will, you use the word, well, you describe what you did as an adaptation. And by the way, I liked it. I think it's a success. Thank you. But adaptation is the word du jour, right? I mean, that's all we've been doing for the last 18 months. I don't know how many of you have gone to the theater with a surgical mask on before. Raise your hands. I mean, a few times maybe, but it was many years ago. And I have to think that people living through a much bigger pandemic, a much more dangerous pandemic, but not altogether unlike the moment we're in. And I think that's to do mainly with matters of quarantine. And we saw it on your stage, people dancing without touching, waving without touching, holding hands without touching. It was very, very clever. But it speaks to the fact that we think we know the vector of the disease. We think we know how it's transmitted. And we do know a lot about that. 17th century people knew more than they ever wanted to know about the bubonic plague. And it was the bubonic plague, you see here, anything else. But they weren't certain about it in the way that we think we are. So for them, the disease was a much more holistic problem to contend with. You had God and his judgment in the mix. You had moral culpabilities and failings in the mix. You had strange moments, the kinds of things. I mean, we were invited to talk about plague, but the other great topic of the day was witchcraft. The new king, James VI I, was convinced at that time anyway that witches were out to get him, and that they in effect were trying to impact the state and him personally. So, and that's not a medieval thing. That's not something, Shakespeare has projected it backwards into the 14th or 15th century, but really the witch hunt, the paranoia about witches is a matter for the 16th and 17th century, unnervingly close to our own time, and perhaps that's why we push it back a little bit further. And I've talked about the plague and written about it sometimes and taught about it many times, but it is different this time because I'm in a pandemic. And I think that there are, be humble. We have vaccines. We have larger spaces we live in. We have all kinds of advantages the 17th century people didn't have. But certain things are the same. That is, quarantine was their best weapon. Just stay away. Separate the infected from the healthy. If you had means, if you had property, if you had relations in the country, then run away. That's best case, because by the 17th century, bubonic plague was largely an urban disease. So you could try and escape it by going to the countryside. They might not be glad to have you. That's why you need friends and countrymen out there. And if your whole life is in town, then that's not going to work. You got to go to Plan B, and Plan B means working to separate the sick from the healthy. And that gets tricky when it's happening within your own home. And we know that happened, and people had horrific, just mind-boggling challenges to face. So 17th century people, unfortunately, never bothered to tell us how many of them lived in a given place, damn it. That's the first thing historians want to know. But we figure that in 1603, when there was a spike, a bad spike in a bad plague epidemic, that about 140,000 people lived in London. It was booming. It was on its way to being the biggest city in the world. And 140,000 doesn't sound that big to us, but it was probably the biggest city in Europe. And 25,000 people died that year in London from the plague. And people didn't have that number at hand. They didn't know that there were 140,000 of them. We can do the math, but they knew. And they talked about the fact that 1 in 5 were dying. And and they were right about that. And to be presumptuous, of course they were right about that. And I think that language is a way of connecting, of reminding each other that everybody's in this together. Everybody has lost somebody. And so quarantine, that attempt at separation was the only thing they had. They tried other things. They tried everything, but we know quarantine was the only thing that could work. But it gets difficult. It was a mind-bogglingly infectious disease that killed people anywhere from 3 to 8 days. And we always forget that the 20% or so of people who contracted the disease and survived often had debilitating illnesses and perhaps what we would call PTSD for the rest of their days. But it's one thing to keep your family away from everybody else, lock yourselves in, lock other people's in, mark the door with a red daub of paint to tell the world at large that there are sick people in there. But what happens if you wake up one morning and it's your mother or daughter or brother or spouse that has the fever, is clearly sick? Everybody knew the signs. They were unmistakable. The town would send people into homes to check, because it was a matter of life and death. But what do? It's your own kin. Do you keep everybody together and risk all dying together? Risk all of your children dying? Or do you send the loved one out to the new camps, the huts, the transit huts? It's really a transition from life to death. And people tried to tend to them as best they could. The people who looked after them were usually widows on a pension. And if you wanted your pension, you better help out. And if you were a widow and aged, perhaps you'd lived through other epidemics and you had some immunity. People did what they could, they did what they had to do, but people died alone, or at least cut off from their friends and family, and amongst strangers, amongst people with, varying instincts for caring. They suffered horrific pain. Sometimes they lost their minds. They lost dignity as their bodies broke down with astonishing speed. And then at the end of that, there was a mass grave. So their family couldn't even mourn them in the normal way. And I think that shadow had to have cast a cloud over all aspects of life. And it's, so for Shakespeare, he's writing, ostensibly, he sets the Scottish play in the distant Scottish past, distant enough that nobody was, knew much about it really. And he made stuff up, and that's fine. But when he reached for those plague metaphors to talk about the times, to talk about rulers and politics, and equating those hard times with the kinds of deadly hard times people were living through, it had to have been a visceral moment in that theater. And I'm sure I've used up my time, but thank you very much.
Okay, everybody can hear me. Okay, so I'm Joanne Rochester. I teach Shakespeare at the University of Saskatchewan. And Gordon initially said to us, I've got facts and figures, I'll be fine. I'm going to be the facts and figures woman, perhaps a little more than I intended to. When Peter contacted me, and I was on sabbatical, and he contacted me, he said, can you come and do this? I said, sure, I'll talk about plague and Macbeth. There's got to be stuff in there. It's so full of corruption and death and illness and images of sickness. And of course, when I sat down and looked at the play, of course, he doesn't talk about the plague. But the play does have some very important connections with the plague experience that Gordon was just talking about. And one of the reasons for this is because, of course, in the Jacobean period of Shakespeare's life, sort of 1603, from 1603 when Elizabeth died and King James came to the throne, which Gordon has already mentioned was a huge spike of infection in London. From that year right through until 1610, the plague was a pretty continuous visitor in London. So there was a appalling death toll in 1603. I think and they tabulated plague deaths by the week. So the worst toll was 3,000 a week, I believe, that's what Leeds Barrel, this is the guy I'm following here. And that was in September of 03. But the thing to know about Shakespeare's theater is that in London, one of the things that they could do to ratchet back infection, it wasn't quarantine, but it was lockdown for one particular group of people. One of the things that they could do was close the theaters. If the plague toll, if the toll of plague deaths rose above 30 in a week, they shut the theaters. Sometimes the actors could manage to wiggle it out a little and squeeze in some performances if it was 40 or below, but generally it was 30. And in the period between 1603, when James came to the throne, through 1606, or 1606, when this play was written, when Macbeth was written, right through to 1610, the theaters were closed more than they were open. In fact, Leeds Barrel, the fellow who has studied this, says that for a period from 1603 to 1607, the theaters were only open for 9 months of the year. And when you consider with plague closures, but also with closures for the Gunpowder Plot aftermath, closures for mourning, periods of national mourning when the French king was assassinated, there was a period of national mourning. So basically, theater and theater productions, and Will really knows what that's like. You need to work. This is a period where if you don't work, you don't eat. So the actors the companies would do a couple of things. One of the things that they would do would be to go on tour outside of London. But of course, if the plague is active in London, you're not that popular when you turn up in Oxfordshire and say, we want to put on some plays. They tend to say, go away. Right? So one of the things that happens is Shakespeare and this is of course for Shakespeare one of his most productive periods. He produces Othello, Measure for Measure, King Lear. James Shapiro's wonderful book on 1606 is called The Year of Lear. He writes Lear, Macbeth, and Antony and Cleopatra in the same frickin' year. And I have spent the past year staring at a blank page, making vague attempts and deleting things, so I just want to dig them up and throw rocks at him. However, he is very obviously impacted by that. The other thing that has an effect on the play as he writes it is, of course, the one place where they can still play. When James came to the throne, he took the King's Men, he took Shakespeare's company, which was then called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, as his servants. And so they became the King's Men in 1603. That didn't mean that the court paid them a salary, but they were given occasional gifts of money, and they performed at the court. So during the bad plague year of 1603, nothing happened. James came to the throne, he was crowned, he had a coronation ceremony in July 25th of 1603, but he didn't have the usual procession through London, which was a big celebration. You know, the sort of public celebrations of his coronation didn't happen for another year. And the other thing that impacted Macbeth specifically, well, actually, let me just go back a bit. I'm not even looking at my notes. So one of the things that happens then is, because there is no way for the players to perform, focusing on providing theater for the court becomes much more important to them than it would normally be. Normally, their bread and butter is bums in seats, right? It's the people of London, that's who they're playing for. Well, now they're trying very deliberately, Will is trying very hard to write new plays for the king, because the king wants new plays. And so, of course, he writes plays about kingship. He writes plays about conflict between siblings. He writes plays about philosophical issues that interest the king. And of course, he writes Macbeth. Macbeth is one of Macbeth's first victims is Banquo. Banquo, of course, is supposed to be James's distant ancestor. And in the cauldron scene where the witches were, Macbeth finally says, F it, I'm just gonna kill everybody, I don't care. And he goes to the Weird Sisters, and they show him spirits, they raise spirits in a cauldron, which give him some wonderful, equivocal prophecies. No man of woman born can kill Macbeth. Till Birnam Wood to Dunazane, I always mispronounce the castle's name, till Birnam Wood comes to the castle, you don't need to worry, right? They tell him, they prophesy impossible things that basically give him false hope, right? And equivocation is a big part of what the play is built around. But at the end of this scene, the witches call up one final figure, and Macbeth says, okay, tell me, will my sons sit on the throne of Scotland? And they show him a procession of kings, 8 kings, who literally parade across the stage. And the last one is shown in a mirror, shown to Macbeth in a mirror, and he says it is a figure that double balls and treble scepters carry. In other words, it's a figure who is king not only of Scotland, but also of England and of Wales. And this, of course, is James. This, probably the first time this play was performed. I've heard this argued before. I didn't believe it until I looked into this, but I think it's true. Probably the first time this play was performed, and certainly the audience for which it was written was James. And so the performance at court would have actually shown James his own face in the mirror that the actor was holding, right? He would have actually seen himself reflected on the stage. And so very, very good. It isn't the way Shakespeare's plays usually worked, but in this particular sliver of time, it seems to have been, right? Okay, I was going to talk about the gunpowder plot, but I'm going to stop because I'm sure I've gone over time. Okay.
Thanks. Thanks, Joe. Well, I'm going to start by making a very safe statement that you can make safely about any Shakespeare play at all. This Shakespeare play is different from every other Shakespeare play. But actually, when it comes to Macbeth, it's really, really different in a very significant and helpful way, especially from the other 3 Shakespearean tragedies, Hamlet, King Lear, and Othello, with which it's most normally bracketed. It's way shorter, And every school child who ever has studied Shakespeare is extremely grateful for the shortness of the Scottish play. It's fully 2 hours shorter than Hamlet, and just about an hour shorter than the other two. You can do it in just a bit over 2 hours if you speed your way through it. And now it's shorter for a very particular reason. And it's shorter because, almost alone among Shakespeare plays, it's about one character only. Now, Shakespeare normally has lots and lots of heroes, lots of protagonists, and lots of subplots on the sort of generous principle. If you don't like this particular plot, here's another one. Don't like that character? Here's another one. Not the Scottish play. The Scottish play is uniquely focused on one character when he's not, even when he's not on the stage. And in fact, he's on the stage, I think, I haven't actually looked into this, probably a higher percentage than any other Shakespeare hero. When he's off the stage, the England scene, the murder of Lady Macduff, the murder of Banquo, even when he's off the stage, he's dominating it completely. He's ordered, he's arranged the action. So this play is totally focused on Mr. M. And it's not just focused on Mr. M. The play takes place in Mr. M's head. And it can be, I've seen some really effective productions in which that is literally true. The other characters, and the great acid test of this is the way you handle the banquet scene. Does Banquo's ghost appear as an actual actor? Or, the other way of doing it, is to have Mr. M demonstrate to the audience that he sees something nobody else sees. He sees the ghost of Banquo in his head. Memorably, particularly in the production, the Royal Shakespeare Company production, with Ian McKellen, who we know very well as Magneto, rehearsing for that role, where that's how he plays that scene. And in the process, terrifying Lady M, Mrs. M, played very well by Judi Dench, who's also rehearsing for her appearances as M, and even the initial is the same, as the commander of James Bond. So that is the sort of the focus of the play. Now, that's one aspect of the play. The other aspect of the play is that we, literary people, love to play the game of what is the historical source of this play. So, did this play begin, as Joe has said, is the wellspring of this play, the main motivation of the play, the accession of James I of Scotland, who became James I of England? Or is it, as many people have argued, the gunpowder plot? And the play is filled with references to the gunpowder plot, and particularly the scene with the porter and his wordplay on equivocation. Well, actually, I think that more than the gunpowder, more than either of these, the real wellspring of the play is the plague, is the pandemic. And of course, as Gordon and Joe have said, the plague was not an abstraction in England at all. And for us, the plague is, we hope, a once-in-a-lifetime event. We hope that now we are emerging from it and it won't come back again. It was not that way, as we know, as both Joe and Gordon have said, in Shakespeare's England. The plague, if it went away, it was going to come back again. A month, 2 months, one day, you're always only a breath away from the plague. And when we consider what is happening in this play, what we can see in this play is in Macbeth's mind, reflections of the plague time around him. He is cribbed and cabined and confined and bound to a stake. He's trapped. These images of confinement occur throughout the play. Scenes in the play take place deep in rooms, locked deep within castles, with a whole series of antechambers you have to go through to get there. And outside the antechamber, the porter of Hell's Gate is knocking on the door. And throughout the play, there is this imagery of stains, of spots, of blood, of gore which runs or is clotted. We have a mother who dashes the brains out of her from his child's nipple as he's sucking and his boneless gums on her nipple. He reaches forward and dashes his brains out. One spot of blood can turn all the green seas red. And sleep. Nobody sleeps. Macbeth has murdered sleep. So all of these And also, too, the way in which impulses become instant transgressions. As Joe said, the moment when Mr. M decides, to hell with it, I'll kill everyone. And so that says, at the moment he says, the firstlings of my thought will become the firstlings of my hand, and he sends his men out to slaughter, for no reason really, apart from the fact that he could do it, to kill Lady Macduff and her children. So we recognise all this. It's not that we've become, in the time of the pandemic, all axe murderers like Mr. M, but I think we recognise much more closely the impress of anxiety, of uncertainty, of suspicion of others, of constant fear, the disruption of the normal patterns of life, and the disruptions of sleep, particularly. Very gloomy, eh? What a cheery play. I remember actually at one point, I remember reading the play when I got to the point about dashing the brains out. I couldn't read anymore. It is that sort of play. And even sitting this morning, sitting through the Royal Shakespeare Company performance, there are moments there which are so harrowing I had to go and take a break and go and look at my tomatoes, think of something else. However, that's not the whole story. The first lines, the first words you see on the page in the edition of Macbeth are thunder and lightning, enter three witches. Now, there's a story behind this. And the story is that in 1608, the King's men, as Joe, who used to be Lord Chamberlain's men, who'd become the favoured company of King James, and in whom Shakespeare was a co-founder and a key member, they took out a lease on the Blackfriars Theatre in 1608. And the Scottish play and Lear and of course the Tempest and others of Shakespeare's late plays were presented in Blackfriars. And imagine that. Imagine the boldness and the courage it took in 1608 England, in the middle of all that uncertainty, to make what an enormous financial gamble. Take out a lease on one of the very first indoor theatres in Europe that could seat around about 1,000 people. It was an enormous risk, but it was also incredibly, fantastically successful. They could put on plays to a smaller audience, to a more exclusive audience, who were willing to pay more money and of course they put on plays for a longer stretch of the year, not just in the summer, but they could play right through the winter. And they didn't have to close the theatre when it rained, or they didn't have to close the theatre when it became too dark. And especially the finances generated by this made possible a whole range of theatrical effects, thunder and lightning, never before possible in theatre, and the direct predecessor of the special effects we now expect of any performance. That happened in 1608. That happened within a few years of the devastating plague of 1603. And here we are, 500 years later, sitting in another new space, also close to a river. Makes you think of the River Wye. There's a very strict reference behind that. And again, I think we are seeing around us a bold step towards, like the Blackfriars Theatre, a space that can put on plays of a kind not before possible here in Saskatchewan in this space. And there's something else about this. I said it was a financial success. Each one of Shakespeare and the 5 original partners of the King's Men cleared £2 each every time there was a sold-out performance in the Blackfriars Theatre. £2 each. Doesn't sound like much until you apply the Peter Robinson patented beer converter. £2 will bought you 2,000 pints of beer in London. I really like to think of Shakespeare with 2,000 pints of beer. But I think the point behind this is that this was an enormous cultural leap forward, but it was also a very shrewd commercial bet. And great culture can only be possible on the back of immense dedication and shrewd commercial sense. And I'd like to finish by paying kind of my own tribute to the person who, more than any other, the Richard Burbage not the William Shakespeare, the Richard Burbage of Saskatoon is Will over here, whose efforts, rather like
Does
Richard
that mean I get
Burbage,
2,000 pints of beer?
yeah, 2,000 pints of beer is coming your way,
Beer's
has brought
in the
this
mail.
possible.
Your
So,
salary, it might be that.
so I think thanks for Will especially for making this possible. But of course, Will be the first to say he didn't do it on his own. And one of the pleasures of me of being on the board for the last year or so is seeing how much has been given by so many people in the community to help this happen and enjoy the Scottish play. Questions?
Yeah, you taking questions?
So your chance. Yes, it's your
Yeah.
turn.
So the question is, I guess, how does this time and place and coming out of a pandemic and this kind of adaptation work? Where do we go from here, and what's coming? Man, if I had that crystal ball, that'd be great. I think theater is changing a lot right now, a ton, and a lot of it is in the industry, sort of out of the audience's view, and a lot of that comes, excuse me, directly from the pandemic. Most of that kind of stuff, though, it's about how we do what we do and whether we treat ourselves and others well, and whether it's a good working environment, and whether all voices have access to it, and a lot of those large questions that are happening in a different way in society right now. They're very much happening in the theater industry. So I really think that the pandemic will change how we make theater. I think it already has. And I think it'll be a bit messy for a while, but at the end of the day, that'll be good. It'll be a hard journey, but it'll be good. I don't know that I have any personal thoughts that my particular adaptation of Macbeth is going to change the theater in general. I have a big ego, but maybe not quite that big. Maybe this is a bit of a sideline on it, but I think it's worth noting that we came out of a pandemic as a theater and made some choices similar to what you were talking about. We didn't produce Midsummer Night's Dream. We didn't produce something fun and happy and all those kinds of things. And that was brought up, that was discussed, that was desired by many people, and many would say that doing Macbeth is not really the right choice coming out of a pandemic. My view on it, though, is there's something about this play that we intrinsically feel about this time, and it's because, we were talking about, does it spring from the historians love playing the what did it spring from game? I find that completely, no offense, a total waste of time. And I always end up doing this when it's me and academics on the panel.
No,
we
I'm
just think differently. We just think differently. And that's because when I look at it, I look at what the playwright was feeling and what his world was like and what was going on in his head to create that piece. And you can't pull apart the gunpowder plot or the plague or the bad night of sex he had the night before, or whatever it is. That whole package is where he was at, and that's how he wrote this play. And then we have to take it and figure how it's going to speak to all the same people in the audience, and how they feel. And a play like Macbeth, it somehow encapsulates how we're all feeling. And it encapsulates everything that's great about theater, which is that we get together and talk about the hard things that are going on in our lives as a group, and we come out feeling like I feel like you and you feel like me, and yes, when they reach their hands across and couldn't quite touch each other, I can't explain why that gets me, but it does get me, and those kinds of things. So I think coming out of the pandemic, theater will be very different, and I'm not so sure that this is what it will be. I think this play will never ever happen again, and it is, I hope, as much as possible, it is a play of this exact moment, and that's what we do in the theater. That's our biggest goal of any goal that we have is to enjoy the ephemeral, not to put it on video, because theater exists between people in an audience and on a stage and a storytelling and a shared experience and a, yes, I do feel like you and you do feel like me. I think I'm totally skirting the question because I have no idea how to answer it. I don't know where theater's going. I'm very concerned about the future of theater, as you can tell, because of the digital that's being put on top of it. And I think what will happen over time is when I stand and I do my pre-show speech before the show and I say, welcome to Shakespeare on the Saskatchewan, no, let me correct myself, welcome back to Shakespeare on the Saskatchewan, you can feel this relief in the audience where they go, yes, I feel that. I just want to be here and connect. And my hope, I'm probably wrong, but my hope is that we'll remember that that's why we do theater, because I think we've forgotten that a lot in the privileges that we've had, and those privileges were taken away from us, and I think some of us in society will recognize that personal, human, face-to-face, shoulder-to-shoulder connection is what theater does, and my hope is that will have a stronger place in how theater goes forward into the future with a whole lot more voices having access to that conversation. That's my hope. I think the corporate world.
Question? Okay, one more question. If,
I
quickly,
actually,
or statement?
I actually wanted to add a
Okay.
tiny thing on top of the Will's comment, specifically about the possible future of theater and the connection of what Will's doing here with that. And that bounces off of what Peter was saying about the 1608 signing of the lease to the Blackfriars. The reason that they signed the lease to the Blackfriars, Blackfriars had been bought by Burbage's father, by the founder of the company in the late 16th century. And they wanted to build a theater there, and they'd been told by the Privy Council that they could not do it. So they leased the theater to a company of children's actors, who are the people that Hamlet complains about in Hamlet, those little eye-asses, and they're making fun of the adult players. That company died, quite literally. A great many of the boys died in the plague, and the company was unable to make any money because they literally could not support themselves. They had no money, and so they collapsed. And it was Will and a couple of the other members of the company decided to take out a loan to buy a lease, partly because they knew that this was a new form of theater, but also because of their version of climate change. The winters were getting colder, and they couldn't use the globe further. So they needed that because of the pressure of the pandemic, because of the pressure of the plague, because of the pressure of the politics, because of everything. They needed a new space, and so they moved into something that they didn't think was going to work. So you move into something that you don't think is going to work, and it turns out to be the future of theater going forward for the next 150 years.
And at the end of the day, times like this make everybody take risks, and that's what they did.
That's right.
That's what we're doing. And if you got nothing to lose, you take a risk. And I hope that keeps going.
And you're stretching the audience's expectations.
Absolutely,
as well.
yeah. Yeah.
But we had a question up here.
Oh, we've answered it
All right.
already. So
Well, I'll just beam you thanks.
Any further comments, questions? Okay, so we can, I think, thanks to everybody, the audience who stayed, and ourselves.